Looking back on the consoles of the past, I can't help but feel nostalgia for them, especially the ones that played a big part in my childhood. The N64 was and is still one of my favorite consoles of all time. But really looking back and analyzing both the console and its titles in more detail, I've come to realize something. Something that's going to piss off a large part of the internet and cause them all to raise their pitchforks at me. And that's that the N64 really hasn't aged that well. Yeah, I thought that was going to happen. The Nintendo 64 was a huge part of my childhood. Released in September of 1996, it was Nintendo's foray into the generation that began the leap into the third dimension of gaming. Although it was revolutionary for the time, and I still love playing most of the N64 library to this day, I have to be honest, a lot of what the N64 was just doesn't hold up well anymore. Really, looking back, the 5th generation in general hasn't aged very well, but at least the PS1 has aged a bit better than the N64, and there's a few reasons why. First off, the N64 controls like crap. Outside of a few games, most of the big hitter titles are just abysmal to play. This is due to a few factors. Number 1 is the controller design itself. Unless you are some weird three-handed creature, you won't be able to comfortably use all the inputs this controller has to offer. You either place your hand here and have digital-only control with the D-pad, or you place your hand here and ditch the D-pad in favor of a single analog stick. Either way, you lose out on using some of the inputs on the controller. Seriously, this is probably the poorest design I've ever seen any first party ever make. I just don't know what they were thinking with this one. Nowadays, there are decent third-party alternatives like the Retro Fighters Brawler 64, but unfortunately the games were still designed only to use one section of the controller, so that doesn't fix the problem. Not only that, but the N64 is where 3D gaming started to happen, but it only has a single analog stick. Imagine playing any modern game with a single analog stick. And sure, there were the C buttons, which were for camera control, but nothing beats having full analog control over your camera. Don't get me wrong, it worked well enough for the time, but going back and playing these games after having had dual analog controllers for so long, it's a bit difficult to control when Mario moves, like dang it, I keep falling off the edge! And on top of that, the analog stick is just poorly made. Internally, they wear down over time, causing the infamous limp joystick. Another problem, which frankly was an N64 exclusive, was the fact that it was the beginning of games moving into the third dimension. Albeit revolutionary for the time, nowadays graphics don't really hold up well. On top of that, games are still trying to figure out how to even make use of the third dimension, or at least how to do it properly. Mario 64 made the jump into 3D perfectly fine, but others, well... Oh gosh, get away! Get it out of here! Another downfall of the Nintendo 64 is that it used cartridges. While it allowed games to load much faster than its disc-based rivals, it also meant games had to be much smaller in file size due to the limitations of flash storage at the time. This pushed some games, like Final Fantasy, to instead develop for the PlayStation, which used CDs. The N64 had a max cartridge size of 64 megabytes. So how much could a PS1 game store? Up to 650 megabytes, that's over 10 times the storage capacity! Along with that, CDs were far cheaper to produce than a cartridge. CDs at the time only cost a few dollars to produce. But if you want to put a game on the N64, it'll cost you $30 or more. The extra cost would eat into profit margins, which was another push for games to go to PlayStation. But the extra cost actually helps the N64, at least in terms of longevity. Although they are more expensive to produce, they are also better suited to survive a long time. As long as you occasionally clean the pins with alcohol and keep it away from moisture, it should last a lot longer than the CDs that the PlayStation uses. That's right, I'm not gonna hate everything about the Nintendo 64, remember, I still love this thing. But there still is the trade-off I mentioned earlier. You know that the graphics and audio had limited space to work with. On PlayStation, you could have CD quality audio and even have pre-rendered video. The N64 with its cartridges simply didn't have the storage size to do that. The N64 sounded and looked okay, but as developers learned to use each system, we saw much better graphics and audio from the PlayStation in the latter half of the generation. I mean, just look at Metal Gear Solid. Even to this day, it's an absolute masterpiece. I mean, just look at Dummy Thick Snake. Nintendo also added this to the top of the system. You know what that is, kids? It's an expansion port, whose sole purpose is to expand the memory, aka RAM. I don't think I've seen any other console where they give you the option to slap in some more RAM to the thing. Which you may think is a good thing, but think of it this way. Most other systems don't include it because they give you what they think will be enough RAM to cover the life of the system. For Nintendo, they just said, put enough for now, and make the user pay for more RAM later if it's needed. Granted, most games didn't require it, but some games did. Luckily, most people got it for free as a pack-in with Donkey Kong Country, but that was because the game had a critical memory leak bug that would cause the game to crash over time. Along with that, you couldn't even keep the expansion pack installed at all times. Sure, most of the time it would be no problem, even with games that didn't support it, and Nintendo themselves tell you that you can, but then you have the special cases like Space Station Silicon Valley, where it would just crash with the pack installed. Which means you had to keep the standard jumper pack around in case a game didn't play nice with the expansion pack. Yeah, I forgot to mention, you can't just leave this expansion slot empty. You must have either the jumper pack or the expansion pack installed. Trying to turn the thing on without either of those will result in the console just not working. Now from what I've heard, the expansion pack was designed to be used with the N64 DD, but we all know how well that turned out. It didn't, which is why we can only discuss how it works with the standard library. Nintendo recommends just leaving the expansion pack in, as it will still work even if the game doesn't support it. But as mentioned prior, it doesn't always work out that way. And here's the thing, some games that do support it end up performing worse than without it. Why? Because they use the expanded RAM to increase resolution and textures at the cost of performance. So if you're planning a speedrun, you may want to reconsider having that expansion pack as it may cost you some time. So, between the poorly designed controller only a 3-headed mutant could properly utilize, the single analog stick for 3D games that wears down over time, game devs having trouble utilizing the third dimension properly, the use of cartridge tech that was more expensive and stored less data, and finally, the expansion pack not being included but required for some games, all the while making other games run slower or even crash. Yes, I would have to say the Nintendo 64 has not aged as well as something like the Super Nintendo. But remember, that doesn't mean I think the system isn't good. I do own 2 of these things, each with some form of modification, and then 4 brand new Retro Fighters Brawler 64 controllers to go along with it. I have fond memories of the system, and majority of the library is still well worth playing, except Mario Kart 64, because that just doesn't control very well. Now if you excuse me, I've got to go. I have an appointment to be burned at the stake by the people at the inn I've pissed off, and I don't want to be late for that.